45 years ago, Jacob Jones, a 7-year-old boy in Philadelphia, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a desperate family and a case that seemed unsolvable. Authorities launched an intensive investigation, but scattered records, faint leads, and physical evidence that had nearly disappeared brought the search to a standstill. For decades, Jacob's family clung to hope and waited for any sign that he might still be alive somewhere. Then one day, with the help of modern DNA technology and genetic genealogy, forgotten clues began to resurface, opening an unexpected new direction for the case. Before we dive deeper into this dramatic story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like the video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Mostly working class, tightly packed neighborhoods, where people knew each other's faces more than names, and kids grew up on sidewalks, front stoops, narrow alleys that adults believed were safe without constant supervision. In the Kensington area in the eastern part of the city, rows of old but tidy attached homes formed a close-knit community where mornings started with the sound of buses, afternoons with kids calling each other to play in the street, and evenings ended with warm light spilling from familiar windows. The Jones family lived there like hundreds of others. The father worked manual labor with fixed hours. The mother managed the household and odd jobs to make ends meet, not affluent but comfortable enough, unremarkable and with nothing that drew neighbors' attention. Jacob Jones was their only child, 7 years old, skinny, dark-haired, quieter than most kids his age, but very familiar with the neighborhood where he grew up. Jacob knew which houses belonged to which acquaintances, where he was allowed to play and where he should just look from afar, and when to head home as the sun started to set. To his family, Jacob was the center of everyday life. Meals revolved around his school schedule. Afternoons were measured by the time he went out to play and came back, and quiet evenings were spent together in the small living room, where everything followed a familiar routine that no one imagined could ever be disrupted. That afternoon started like any other, with no warning signs of anything unusual. Jacob was allowed out for a short time, within a range the family believed was completely familiar, where they could see most of the street just by standing at the front door. In that steady flow of daily life, a strange detail appeared, but wasn't significant enough to prompt an immediate reaction from the adults. An unfamiliar presence, behavior slightly out of sync with the neighborhood's normal rhythm. Something that briefly unsettled the sense of security before it was quickly reassured by the thought that everything was still under control. The adults' response at the time wasn't fear but hesitation, between vague suspicion and the habit of trusting the familiar surroundings. They chose to believe nothing serious was happening, that this neighborhood had raised generations of kids, without incident. Any early warning signs, if there were any, passed quickly, obscured by routine and the complacency built up over years. Enough time passed for it to become unusual, and Jacob didn't return as usual. At first it was just a minor delay, then it became a void that halted the household routine. The family started calling his name, stepping out to search the familiar area, asking neighbors who usually saw Jacob playing, expanding the search instinctively rather than by any plan. Initial calm quickly gave way to panic, as every familiar street yielded no answers, as people around could only offer scattered and inconsistent memories of the last time they saw the boy. Time no longer flowed evenly but became heavy, stretching minute by minute, while the spontaneous search radius widened without results. As daylight faded over the row homes and the neighborhood settled into evening, the unease became undeniable, impossible to keep brushing aside. The Jones family had to confront a possibility they hadn't considered before. In that moment, when all spontaneous searches had run out of hope, and the familiar residential area no longer felt safe, the decision to call the police was made not as a formality, but as an admission that Jacob Jones, the 7-year-old who had been within their daily routine just hours earlier, had truly vanished. The missing person report was received that same evening, while the Jones family was still standing in front of their house, not yet having cleared away the signs of chaos from their just-ended spontaneous search. And from that point on, Jacob Jones's disappearance was no longer just one family's private panic, but officially became a recorded case in the Philadelphia Police Department system. According to procedures of that era, initial information was taken at a basic level: the child's name, age, home address, last seen time, and what the family believed had happened during the period Jacob didn't return. A file was hastily created that night, on paper with brief descriptions and many blanks still unfilled, accurately reflecting the early stage when all facts were vague and entirely dependent on human memory. The assigned investigator approached the family shortly after the report was logged, not treating it as a clear criminal case, but as a missing child situation that needed quick verification to see if it was just getting lost or delayed returning. During intake, police focused on reconstructing the last timeline Jacob was seen, determining the disappearance window based on family and neighbor accounts, and initially circling the geographic area within a 7-year-old's walking range. Questions were more guiding than in-depth investigating, aimed at quickly determining if there were signs of force or immediate danger. And in the context of 1960 Philadelphia, where child abduction wasn't yet seen as a common threat, many initial assumptions leaned toward Jacob simply wandering off or being held up somewhere in the neighborhood without anyone notifying yet. Classifying the case under contemporary professional standards played a key role from the very first hours. The file was placed in the category of missing children without clear criminal indicators, an administrative decision that directly affected resource mobilization, priority level, and scope of action by authorities. That classification led to a cautious investigation approach, focusing on verifying information and checking obvious possibilities first, rather than activating aggressive measures or expanding to more serious hypotheses. On the first night, police conducted a quick sweep of the area around the Jones home, re-interviewed neighbors who had joined the spontaneous search, recorded what they remembered about the timing and circumstances of Jacob's last appearance, and tried to narrow the disappearance window as precisely as possible. Every small detail was noted as a potential piece of the puzzle, even without basis yet to assess their true value, and the entire process took place under limitations in manpower, tools, and professional awareness compared to later investigation standards. Initial investigative direction decisions weren't made after lengthy analysis, but gradually formed from common assumptions of the era. A child familiar with the neighborhood, disappearing in a short time, no clear signs of violence at home, was typically seen as likely to return on his own, or be found nearby soon. On that basis, authorities prioritized checking nearby public places, kids frequented, and natural movement possibilities, rather than immediately expanding to more complex scenarios. In the first 24 hours, the investigation was deployed with the goal of controlling the situation and gathering as much information as possible before time eroded witness memory accuracy, but still limited by a probing rather than pursuit-oriented approach. The Jones family, now shifted from panic to tense waiting, became the central information source for the entire file, while they themselves had to adjust to the reality that every detail they provided, no matter how small, could influence the search direction. The atmosphere in those early hours was both urgent and vague, as the investigation had officially begun, but didn't yet take the shape of a case needing to be cracked, and the absence of clear signs meant every decision relied on conventional assumptions rather than evidence-based conclusions. Filing the case, establishing timeline and disappearance range, classifying it, and carrying out initial investigative steps happened continuously in a chain of actions, creating the sense that the machinery had been activated, even though in reality it was operating within the limited framework of the era and contemporary professional awareness. While the Jones family had to entrust the official process with fragile hope that the system would deliver answers, the investigation in the first 24 hours closed with more questions than leads, and with a file open but not yet heavy enough to completely change the perception of Jacob Jones's disappearance. Immediately after the investigation was officially activated, the authorities' core activity in this phase focused entirely on gathering initial data, aiming to record as much raw information as possible before time, daily activities, and unconscious human interference altered or erased it. The area where Jacob Jones was last seen was identified based on family and nearest neighbors' accounts, and surveyed in a manner consistent with standards of that era, treating it as a living space to be checked, rather than a strict crime scene. Police walked the streets within the residential area, checking main and side entrances, front steps, gaps between attached homes, narrow alleys, small vacant lots, and familiar kid hangouts, to identify spots Jacob might have passed through in the short time before disappearing. The survey range was set based on a 7-year-old's natural mobility combined with local terrain, but no hard boundaries were applied to control access, leaving the survey space open and continually affected by normal resident activity. Meanwhile, scene preservation wasn't prioritized separately, since at that point there were no clear physical signs of serious criminal activity, and the general view still leaned toward Jacob simply getting lost or delayed somewhere in the neighborhood. Alongside spatial surveying, police began collecting witness statements, dividing them into two main groups: those directly present during the disappearance window, and those with only indirect knowledge through observation or hearsay. Witness interviews were conducted in person, handwritten, relying entirely on memory and voluntary cooperation, without recording devices, video or standardized statement systems like later years. Each witness was asked to recount what they remembered about timing, location and circumstances related to Jacob, but their expression detail level and certainty varied significantly, reflecting differences in observation and recall ability. Some statements focused on a specific moment but without clear timing. Others described context relatively accurately, but vaguely on sequence, and some witnesses unconsciously added details based on personal guesswork rather than direct memory. During recording, police didn't immediately assess statement reliability, but prioritized storing all raw information, believing any detail, however small or vague, could become important in the overall picture later. However, this approach also led to an initial dataset full of internal contradictions, as statements not only differed between witnesses but changed over time, especially when the same person was re-interviewed multiple times in one day or subsequent day. Minor differences in timing, direction of movement, or unfamiliar people in the area started overlapping, creating a fragmented information network without tools or basis yet to sort by relevance. In that context, immediate verification was nearly impossible, lacking clear physical evidence for cross-checking, and most collected data relied on human memory, easily influenced by emotion, pressure and community information. Lack of scene preservation further increased data loss risk, as the disappearance area continued normal use, potentially unintentionally erasing any physical traces that might have existed. Factors like minor spatial disturbances, object positions, or temporary marks weren't systematically recorded, not due to individual negligence, but because contemporary professional awareness didn't emphasize scene protection in missing persons cases without clear criminal signs. Instead, investigative focus remained on people and verbal information, with belief that the decisive clue would come from an accurate statement or key witness. As raw data volume grew, police began compiling it into lists and separate notes, including surveyed locations, interviewed people and main content of their statements, but no classification or deep analysis was performed at this stage. The entire process's goal remained building the fullest possible unprocessed information foundation to avoid missing details that could become important as the investigation progressed. By the end of the initial data collection phase, a body of raw information had formed, fully reflecting what the neighborhood, witnesses and living space could provide in the hours after Jacob's disappearance. This dataset, though fragmented and contradictory, was still seen as the only basis authorities could rely on at the time, as it captured the case's state before time continued fading memories and altering context. Within this section's scope, the investigation stopped at recording and storing, without reaching any inferences or conclusions, because all collected data still needed placement in a later analysis process to uncover their true meaning in explaining Jacob Jones's disappearance. From the raw dataset collected in the initial hours after Jacob Jones disappeared, the investigative team moved into the phase of processing and organizing information, with the goal of transforming scattered notes into a cognitive structure capable of guiding subsequent decisions, even though the data at this point remained incomplete and riddled with contradictions. Witness statements were reviewed more systematically, not only chronologically, but also spatially, to identify the rare points of intersection between different memories and gradually eliminate details showing signs of influence from speculation or information circulating in the community. Differences in the timing of Jacob's last sighting were compared side by side to narrow down the disappearance window to the most reasonable extent possible, while descriptions of location and direction of movement were cross-referenced with neighborhood maps to determine routes, stops, spaces the boy could have accessed in that short time frame. This evaluation process revealed that the existing data was not entirely consistent, but neither was it entirely worthless. Instead, it accurately reflected the fate of a disappearance occurring in an open living environment where the boundary between direct observation and personal inference is easily blurred. Investigators had to continually balance retaining information to avoid missing anything, and organizing data by levels of specificity, consistency, and verifiability, while lacking strong physical evidence to serve as an anchor. On that basis, they began constructing primary hypotheses, not to assert what had happened, but to create scenario frameworks that could encompass all current data and prevent the investigation from becoming scattered. The two most prominent hypotheses quickly took shape: the possibility that Jacob had wandered off on his own within the familiar confines of the neighborhood, and the possibility that Jacob had been led away from the area by someone else in a short time, without drawing attention. Each hypothesis was examined independently, based on specific factors such as Jacob's age, his familiarity with the surrounding environment, daily habits, and the absence of clear physical signs at the residence. When weighing these two possibilities, investigators were forced to confront the limitations of the data. The wandering hypothesis was supported by the reality that children in the area frequently moved freely, and Jacob was no stranger to the nearby street, while the abduction hypothesis relied on vague witness details about the presence of strangers and Jacob's complete disappearance in a very short period. This comparison was not intended to immediately rule out one possibility, but to assess how well each hypothesis aligned with what had been recorded, thereby shaping the allocation of attention and investigative resources. Parallel to building general hypotheses, the investigative team proceeded to narrow down subjects in key areas, based on overlaps between witness data, geographical features, and Jacob's potential mobility. Areas were evaluated by accessibility, frequency of mention in statements, and relative position to Jacob's last sighting, forming a priority map that helped investigators visualize spaces requiring greater focus in the next phase. For subjects, the list was formed not to identify specific suspects, but to recognize individuals whose presence, connections, or activities overlapped with critical timelines and locations, including both familiar residents and those less frequently present but mentioned by witnesses. This narrowing was more orientational than accusatory, reflecting the necessary caution in a phase where any assumption could shift with new data. Throughout the analysis process, investigators were fully aware that assumptions formed early tend to strongly influence how subsequent information is interpreted, a common but dangerous cognitive phenomenon in investigations, especially with incomplete initial data. Therefore, hypotheses were kept open, allowing for adjustment as needed, while being clearly documented to avoid unconsciously favoring one scenario simply because it fit initial expectations. However, the reality of investigative work also required a common reference framework for team coordination, and these assumptions, though limited, served as the tool to prevent paralysis amid fragmented information. The initial assumptions, from classifying the case to assessing the plausibility of scenarios, gradually became the foundation guiding the entire subsequent process, determining what was considered reasonable, what was deemed less likely, and what needed priority checking given limited resources. This analysis process also highlighted a key reality: the current data was sufficient to rule out extreme scenarios, but not strong enough to definitively affirm any hypothesis, forcing the investigation to continue operating in a state of controlled uncertainty. By the end of this phase, the outcome was not an answer to Jacob Jones's fate, but a set of hypotheses built on existing data specific enough to guide action, yet flexible enough to adapt to potential new information. Within the scope of this section, the investigation remained at the stage of analysis and cognitive organization, without transitioning to large-scale searches or pursuing a single scenario to the end, accurately reflecting the state of a case on the threshold between understanding what had occurred and deciding next steps. Once the initial hypotheses had been formed and agreed upon as a common guiding framework for the entire involved force, the investigation entered a phase of larger-scale action where the focus shifted from recording or analyzing data to deploying field searches directly based on the assumptions then considered most plausible. Search personnel were mobilized from various sources across the city, including police units not directly handling the case, but capable of canvassing areas, support staff for logistics, and groups experienced in fieldwork, to increase the density of official presence on the ground. This mobilization followed the pace and administrative mechanisms of the 1960s, where each reinforcement relied on internal coordination rather than modern rapid response systems, making the expansion of forces more sequential than immediate. Alongside augmenting official personnel, the search was reorganized toward tighter coordination with the local community, leveraging existing social networks such as churches, schools, neighborhood associations, and community organizations that played a central role in Philadelphia's social life at the time. These organizations became bridges between police and residents, enabling more systematic dissemination of disappearance information while facilitating resident participation in searches within assigned areas and timeframes, rather than the scattered actions of the initial spontaneous feint. The search expanded according to the logic of the established hypotheses, meaning each hypothesis drove a different spatial approach and method, though they were implemented in parallel rather than mutually exclusive. For the possibility of Jacob wandering off on his own, search teams focused on thoroughly checking areas within a 7-year-old child's reasonable range of movement, including routes leading out of the neighborhood, small parks, vacant lots, entrances to public facilities, and places children frequently visit, assuming Jacob might have gone farther than usual or encountered an obstacle preventing his return. For the possibility of Jacob being led away by someone else, the search scope extended to traffic areas, transit, and public spaces where an adult could remove a child from the neighborhood unnoticed, though implementation in this direction remained limited by lack of specific information and suitable investigative tools. Coordination between official search teams and the community created a broad human coverage network, but also increased complexity in information management, as each participant brought their own observation style, attention level. In this context, local media began playing an increasingly prominent role, taking Jacob Jones's disappearance beyond the neighborhood and reaching a wider public in the city and surrounding area. News reports, announcements, and articles were disseminated to call for attention and support, providing basic details about Jacob to enhance recognition while encouraging anyone with relevant information to contact authority. Media involvement quickly transformed the scale of incoming information, as not only local residents, but also individuals farther away began reporting observations, suspicions, or memories they believed related to the case. Public tips surged exponentially, creating a rich but unsifted data pool where potentially valuable details coexisted with inaccurate, mistaken, or entirely unrelated information. In this phase, the investigative priority was not immediate assessment of each lead's accuracy, but reception, recording, and preliminary categorization by alignment with pursued hypotheses, to avoid missing any detail that might become significant in broader context. The initial hypotheses served as an organizational framework, helping investigators direct resource allocation and prioritize processing, but they were not yet used to judge or definitively exclude other possibilities. The expanded search continued over many days, with flexible adjustments to scope and methods based on the latest incoming information, though no formal mechanism existed for real-time evaluation of each direction's effectiveness. Jacob's family, in this context, was both the center of public attention and under heavy psychological pressure, as each new lead sparked waves of hope quickly challenged by the lack of concrete result. The dense presence of search forces, community, and media created a sense that all resources were mobilized and all possibilities considered, reinforcing belief that finding Jacob was only a matter of time, even as the hypotheses themselves lacked verified evidence. Throughout this phase, the investigation operated on a logic of act first, evaluate later, reflecting a system striving for rapid response amid time pressure and societal expectations, rather than pausing to reassess foundational assumptions without clear result. By the peak of scale and intensity in the hypothesis-based expanded search, collected information far exceeded the early phase, participation networks spanned multiple areas, and public attention reached its highest since the disappearance. Yet the investigation had not touched a decisive lead sufficient to fully confirm or refute any scenario, leaving the process in a state of continuous intense action without a true breakthrough. Amid the continuing increase in information from the community and media following the expanded search phase, the investigation gradually entered a new state where the need for a clear direction became more urgent than ever, and that very pressure caused a specific lead to be elevated to the center of the entire process. This lead did not emerge as decisive evidence, but formed from relative repetition across multiple sources, creating a sense of higher reliability compared to the rest of the fragmented and contradictory data stream. In the eyes of investigators facing growing expectations from the victim's family, local community, and internal system, this lead represented a chance to escape prolonged groping, as it seemed to align with one of the prior hypotheses and offered a relatively coherent narrative to pursue. Overvaluing this lead did not occur in a single decision, but resulted from multiple discussions, comparisons, and selections, where other information was gradually disadvantaged for lacking similar progress potential. Once the key lead was established as the main axis, resource reallocation occurred almost naturally, with personnel time and investigative attention adjusted to maximize verification and exploitation of this direction. Teams previously searching across multiple hypotheses were reorganized, with clear priority for tasks directly tied to the key lead, while unrelated activities were scaled back or paused to avoid resource dispersion. This focused decision, in practical context, was reasonable for management, as prolonged spreading without concrete results risks fatigue and disorientation. However, that short-term rationality created long-term strategic misalignment, as other hypotheses, though unrefuted, were pushed outside priority, simply for not directly serving the pursued direction. Over time, the attention disparity across hypotheses became increasingly evident, not only in resource allocation, but in how data was received and interpreted. New information was first evaluated by fit with the key lead, rather than as independent pieces potentially challenging or adjusting the current framework. This self-reinforcing mechanism caused the investigation to operate in a cognitive loop, where fitting details were seen as reinforcing evidence, while mismatches were categorized as unclear or less relevant. Strategic imbalance thus became not just a resource issue but a perspective one, as the ability to question foundational assumptions gradually declined. In that state, hypotheses once built in parallel lost vitality, not because proven wrong but because no longer sustained by ongoing attention and testing. These directions lingered as paper contingencies, but lacked real-world pursuit with equal seriousness, making future reversion harder as related data went unupdated or pursued. Pivotal directional deviation began forming from this subtle shift, as the key lead moved from a possibility needing verification to the default pivot for all decisions, despite lacking independent confirmation. This deviation was not the result of individual error but the consequence of a chain of reasonable choices under high pressure, where the need for quick progress inadvertently overrode balance across hypotheses. In pursuing the key lead, the investigation continued generating activity, reports, and updates, maintaining a sense of ongoing progress, while growing dependent on whether this lead yielded something concrete. As time passed without expected results, this dependency became a vulnerability, as reverting to broaden other directions was no longer easy, with resources reallocated and attention shaped into a rut. Within this section's scope, the investigation did not repeat prior search activities, but focused on deepening one direction with belief that concentration would yield breakthrough, at the cost of narrowed overall vision. By this phase's end, strategic deviation had become operational reality, with the entire effort to find Jacob Jones anchored to an incompletely verified lead, creating a fragile state where further progress depended on whether that lead truly led to answers, laying groundwork for profound consequences that no one in the investigation could yet fully recognize or predict. As the entire investigative focus had been poured into the lead considered pivotal, reality began to reveal itself in a slow but undeniable manner that this direction was not yielding the results initially expected. The efforts to delve deeply into the key lead, though carried out with a high degree of concentration and considerable perseverance, gradually entered a state of repetition as additional checks failed to produce new information sufficient to strengthen or expand the hypothesis being pursued. Points that initially seemed promising began to fall silent. Connections could not be confirmed with independent data, and the gap between expectations and reality became increasingly evident. Meanwhile, witnesses previously regarded as directly related to the key lead were unable to provide any new data, not due to lack of cooperation but because they had already shared everything they remembered in prior interaction. Re-interviewing witnesses, even when conducted carefully, yielded no breakthroughs, as their memories not only failed to add details, but tended to fade over time, blurring the already unclear boundaries between direct observation and inference. Minor differences in accounts, rather than helping to clarify the overall picture, further emphasized the limitations of witness data when unsupported by physical evidence or objective information. Parallel to the exhaustion of witness data, the list of suspects previously circled within the framework of the key lead also gradually narrowed, not because the perpetrator was identified, but because individuals were successively ruled out or became unreachable under the current investigative criteria. Some suspects were verified as absent during the relevant time period, others no longer fell within the geographic scope or lacked sufficient factors to continue pursuing, while the remaining cases could not be linked to the lead with concrete evidence. This elimination process, though necessary, did not bring a sense of progress, as each name crossed off the list did not lead to a new direction, but only further clarified that the path being followed might not lead to the desired outcome. As the key lead gradually lost its initial weight, the inevitable consequence was that the intensity of active investigation began to decline, not due to an official decision, but as a natural response of the system to the absence of concrete result. In-depth pursuit activities gradually decreased in frequency, meetings focused on the main lead became less frequent, and resource allocation grew more cautious when there was no longer a clear basis to justify continuing to pour effort as before. This decline did not occur abruptly but manifested through small changes in the daily rhythm of the investigation. As priorities were adjusted, personnel were reassigned to other tasks, and the case gradually lost its central position on the priority list of the authority. In that context, hypotheses previously set aside during the period of intense focus were not fully revived, as the time and resources needed to revisit them were no longer available as before, and related data had not been continuously maintained or updated. The investigation fell into a suspended state, where there was no longer sufficient momentum to pursue the key lead to the end, but also no conditions yet to open a new direction convincing enough. Jacob's family, though still informed about the general situation, began to clearly sense the change in the pace of the investigation, as updates became less frequent and more summative than indicative of specific progress. Pressure from the community and media, which had once played a role in driving action during the expanded search phase, also gradually waned as there was no new information to sustain attention, causing the case to slowly fade from the center of public opinion. Within the investigative team, the state of impasse became clearer through each case review, as all existing data had been exploited to the maximum within the framework of the pursued hypothesis, but was still insufficient and proficient, create a turning point. The absence of new evidence made continuing the investigation in the old way less effective, while exposing structural limitations of the investigation at this stage, from over-reliance on an unverified lead, to the lack of room to expand without new data. This impasse did not mean the investigation officially stopped, but reflected a transitional phase, where active operations gradually gave way to file maintenance and waiting for new factors that could change the situation. Internal reviews began to focus more on summarizing what had been done and what had not, preparing for the possibility of adjusting the approach in the future, though no administrative decision had been made at that point. By the end of this phase, the investigation into Jacob Jones's disappearance existed in a fragile state, where the key lead had failed to produce results. Witness data no longer developed, potential suspects were successively ruled out or became inaccessible, and the intensity of active investigation had markedly declined, creating a prolonged silence in which the case remained unsolved, but had not yet been officially shifted to another status, leaving the entire process on the blurred boundary between continuation and pause. After the prolonged phase of declining investigation that no longer produced any substantial progress, the change in the case's status did not come with a sudden twist, but formed gradually through a series of administrative internal evaluation, where practical factors began to override initial expectations. Comprehensive reports were prepared to review the entire investigative process that had taken place, from initial data collection steps to the pursuit of the key lead, and the common conclusion was not the failure of an individual or a single decision, but the reasonable exhaustion of feasible investigative directions under the existing information and resources. The administrative decision to change the case status was made in that context, as a technical step more than an emotional one, to accurately reflect the reality that there was no longer a basis for maintaining high-intensity active investigative operation. Shifting to cold case status did not mean abandoning the case, but it marked the official end of the hot investigation phase. where all resources were mobilized with the goal of finding answers in a short time. From that point, active pursuit operations ceased. No more large-scale searches, no more relentless lead chasing, and no more regular presence of investigative forces in the area where Jacob Jones disappeared. Instead, the case was moved to a different operational mode, where the focus shifted from action to storage, from searching to waiting. The case file was formalized, with reorganization of documents, transcripts, statements and reports collected throughout the investigation, ensuring that all existing information was fully recorded and accessible in the future if needed. This archiving was official and systematic, reflecting the administrative requirements for managing hundreds of unsolved cases, where each file needed to be placed in the correct position in the data repository to avoid loss or duplication. Along with the archiving process, changes in assigned personnel also occurred quietly but clearly, as the case was no longer assigned to a specific investigator or dedicated team for regular monitoring, but became a file without direct daily responsibility. Responsibility for the case shifted from individuals to the system, where any new information, if it appeared, would be handled through general procedures rather than a familiar point of contact. This change was not only organizational but also profoundly affected how the case existed in reality, as there was no longer anyone closely monitoring every small detail or proactively seeking new connection. For Jacob's family, the shift to cold case status was communicated as an unavoidable reality, accompanied by assurances that the file would be reopened if new information emerged, but also implying that all active efforts had reached their limit. From the system's perspective, this was a rational decision to allocate resources to cases with higher potential for progress, but from a human perspective, it marked the closing of a phase of hope sustained by continuous action. In this new status, the case entered a waiting phase, where time became the dominant factor, not in the sense of urgency but of erosion, as each passing day without new information increased the distance between the present and the moment Jacob disappeared. The cold case file existed as a static entity in the system, ready to be reactivated but no longer directly impacting the daily operations of the authority. This transition also changed how the case was perceived internally, as it was no longer viewed as a situation requiring immediate response, but as an unsolved issue on a long list of similar cases, awaiting a new factor strong enough to shift the situation. From that point onward, any developments related to the case depended on the emergence of information or tools that did not exist at the time, making the future of the investigation vague and unpredictable. Ending the hot investigation thread did not come with a clear conclusion, but only confirmed that within the framework of what had been done, there were no further paths to continue without repeating itself. The Jacob Jones case, from then on, was no longer an ongoing process, but became a stamped waiting file, carrying all the data, hypotheses and efforts from the previous phase into a prolonged silence in which the boy's disappearance existed as an unanswered question, preserved in the system and in the memories of those involved, but no longer driven by active investigative action. As the file on Jacob Jones's disappearance had been shifted to waiting status and gradually sank deeper into the administrative storage system, the boy's life did not stop or freeze along with the case, but continued in a completely separate direction, where the name Jacob Jones was no longer used, and no longer held any practical meaning in his daily life. Jacob began to exist under a new identity, a different name called out in family activities, recorded in surrounding social relationships, and gradually becoming the sole marker to identify him in the eyes of those he interacted with. This change did not occur as a conscious or chosen process, but as a result of circumstances imposed on a child too young to understand or resist, making the new identity a passively accepted but enduring reality. In the social and administrative context of the early 90s, where systems for resident registration, birth records, and individual tracking were still fragmented, a child appearing under a different name did not immediately raise suspicion, especially when those around him had no specific reason to question his past. The circumstances leading to this identity change were tied to gaps in control processes, where documents could be created or supplemented without deep cross-referencing with central data, allowing a young individual to enter a different life without detection by the system. The use of the new name was not limited to the family or immediate environment, but quickly extended to more formal spaces, such as schools, medical facilities, and community organizations, where the new identity was recorded and reinforced through administrative procedure, even though its foundation was incomplete. Parallel to the name change was the deficiency or irregularity in personal documents, as the chain of records related to Jacob's birth, early years, and initial care either did not exist or were not tightly linked to the new identity. Documents that appeared later were patchwork, sufficient to meet immediate requirements, but not forming a seamless history traceable back to his true origin. These gaps were not seen as serious warning signs in that era's context, when cross-verification between agencies was not common and inconsistencies in personal documents were not rare, especially for children with complicated backgrounds. The result was that Jacob existed in a legally ambiguous state, where his current identity was recognized enough to participate in social life, but not connected to any original records that could lead back to his biological family or the past left behind. At the same time, the severance of connection with his original family occurred thoroughly, not through an official decision or confrontational action, but through prolonged silence and the absence of any communication channel between the two parallel worlds. Jacob's biological family continued to exist in the space of the cold case file, where his name was mentioned as a missing child without resolution, while Jacob himself, under the new identity, grew up without any memories or information about his biological origin. This severance was maintained not only by geographic distance or time, but also by the structure of the search system, which relied on matching names, documents, and family relationships to trace individuals, factors that Jacob in his new state completely lacked. Existing outside the search system became a prolonged reality, as Jacob did not appear in any lists that could be compared to the 1960 missing person file, and left no clear enough traces to trigger attention from authorities. His new identity functioned as a legal shell, completely covering the past and creating an insurmountable distance using the traditional investigative methods of that period. Over time, this existence outside the system gradually became stable and reinforced, as Jacob continued to use the new identity in every aspect of life, from education and healthcare to social activities without encountering significant interruption. To those around him, he was a legitimate individual with a name and a history sufficient to meet society's basic requirements, even though that history was built on incomplete and unverified foundation. The lack of comprehensive cross-referencing mechanisms allowed the new identity to gradually become the only reality Jacob knew, while the old identity was pushed back into a nameless, memoryless, and unsupported past. Within the scope of this part, the core issue does not lie in where Jacob was taken or by whom, but in the legal and social state in which he existed after the disappearance, a state that allowed him to live a life completely detached from the missing person file that had been opened. The identity change, combined with irregularities in documents and the complete severance from his original family, created a void that the search system could not fill with the tools available, making Jacob Jones, under his new name, an individual who was fully present in real life yet completely invisible to the very system designed to find him. By the end of this phase, the separation between the person and the file was complete, as Jacob existed as an independent individual with a new identity, while Jacob Jones remained only a name resting quietly in the cold case file, with no intersection, no connection, and no automechanism for the two realities to meet again. As Jacob's new identity gradually became a stable shell surrounding his life, his childhood continued in an environment completely different from what had been left behind, where all family activities followed rules and rhythms that he had no ability to compare or contrast. The new family provided Jacob with a clearly structured living space, where relationships were defined by current roles rather than memories or history, and where he learned to observe, adapt, and survive without needing to question his origins. Daily routines unfolded regularly, from meal times to small household habits, creating a sense of surface stability, but that stability did not come with a complete feeling of belonging, as Jacob always had to adjust his behavior to fit the expectations around him. In this environment, he learned to stay silent when necessary, follow unspoken rules, and observe the adults' reactions to determine safe boundaries for himself, a process of adaptation that was more instinctive than deliberate. Upon entering school, Jacob continued to face a new social space, where his new identity was taken as a given and no one questioned it. But that very obviousness highlighted the sense of alienation that he could not put into words. Jacob's school experience was unremarkable in any way. He was neither a troublemaking child nor an outstanding student, but existed in the middle ground, enough to avoid drawing attention but not enough to leave a clear mark. In the classroom, Jacob observed his peers talking about their families and stories from when they were little, and gradually realized that his own memories were not seamless like theirs, that there were gaps he could not fill with specific images or emotion. Simple questions from teachers or friends about the past sometimes left him flustered, not because he lacked answers, but because the prepared answers from his new identity evoked no real feeling. Early psychological signs began to appear subtly, not clear enough to be recognized as a problem, but sufficient to shape how Jacob interacted with the world around him, as he tended to be vigilant, reserved, and always maintained an invisible distance from others. He learned forced adaptation, adjusting emotions and behaviors to suit circumstances, even when that meant suppressing natural reactions or unresolved questions. This adaptation was not the result of intentional teaching, but a natural response from a child living in an environment where safety depended on not causing disruption. Over time, forced adaptation became a habit, allowing Jacob to blend in outwardly, but making it difficult to connect deeply with others, as every relationship was built on a foundation of constant adjustment. Jacob's childhood memories thus became fragmented, not due to a lack of experiences, but because those experiences were not tied to a seamless personal narrative, as the early years had been severed from the rest of his life. He could recall isolated details, moments untethered to specific time or context, but could not string them together into a clear stream of recollection, causing the past to exist as scattered fragments rather than a solid foundation. In the new family life, Jacob learned to play the role of a normal child, participating in shared activities, following the established rules and expectations, but that participation was more functional than emotional, as he did what was needed to maintain stability. Small behavioral differences, such as excessive reserve or a tendency to observe more than participate, were often seen as personality traits rather than signs of a deeper issue, causing them to go unnoticed or unaddressed. The school experience continued to reinforce the feeling that Jacob was living in a pre-written story, where he knew his role but not the origin of the script, making every success or failure feel distant. The absence of a seamless childhood memory did not create an immediate crisis, but it gradually shaped how Jacob viewed himself, as he struggled to determine where he belonged and why he was in his current position. Within the framework of this section, Jacob's childhood after disappearing was not marked by major events or dramatic incidents, but by a series of quiet adaptations, where surface stability masked deeper voids in his sense of self. The living environment, school experiences, early psychological signs, and fragmented memories combined to form a unique foundation of life experience, where Jacob existed and grew up without the language or tools to name the rupture that had occurred earlier. By the end of this period, Jacob's childhood closed like an incomplete chapter, complete in form but lacking internal cohesion, leaving behind a person who had learned to adapt to new circumstances, but still carried voids in memory and emotion that he himself had never had the opportunity to understand or confront. As Jacob continued to grow under the new identity that had been accepted in everyday life, the first traces of mismatch began to appear, not in personal feelings or social relationships, but in the very administrative records that followed him through each stage of development. Jacob's educational records were formed sporadically over the years, sufficient to meet enrollment and attendance requirements normally, but lacking the continuity typically seen in children with a stable life from birth. The early school years had no clear transfer records. Information about preschool or previous classes was vague or not fully documented, and determining Jacob's initial educational process relied mainly on declarations rather than cross-referenced documents. Grade reports, teacher comments, and administrative data existed as separate pieces, not connected into a unified sequence reflecting a seamless educational journey, but in the context of that era, this deficiency was not severe enough to trigger a deeper review from the school or educational authorities. Alongside the educational records, Jacob's medical records also revealed systematic inconsistencies, as information related to the newborn period, initial vaccinations, and early healthcare history was either non-existent or added later without original documents for verification. Healthcare facilities recorded Jacob as a valid patient at the time of intake, but had no ability to fully trace back to the early years, resulting in medical records being built from a certain age onward, leaving the prior period completely blank. The lack of initial medical data was not considered unusual in an environment where paper records were easily lost, and information sharing between facilities was limited, causing these gaps to be accepted as consequences of circumstances rather than signs of a more serious issue. Accompanying this were multiple changes of residence in the early years, creating an unstable chain of addresses, where each move led to the formation of new records or additions to old ones, without tight linkage between locations. These changes disrupted the accumulation of administrative data, as each local agency only held partial information about Jacob, without a mechanism for comprehensive cross-checking with other areas. The result was the absence of a central record fully reflecting Jacob's residential history, only local fragmented and unsynchronized dataset. Another notable feature was the complete lack of any official data about Jacob before a certain age, creating a clear boundary between the recorded period and the entirely blank administrative phase. This gap was not filled by later supplementary documents, but persisted as a blind spot in the entire system of personal data related to him, making tracing back to origins impossible through conventional methods. In that context, Jacob had no ability to self-verify his origins through paperwork or official records, as every path backward led to gaps or insufficient information for comparison. Administrative agencies accepted Jacob based on what was provided at the time, without obligation or tools for deeper verification, allowing the new identity to continue being legally reinforced despite its incomplete data foundation. The mismatch between different types of records did not create direct conflict in daily life, as each system operated relatively independently and only required minimal information to continue processing. Educational records did not need detailed medical data, medical records did not require educational history, and address changes were updated locally without national cross-referencing, creating an environment where gaps could coexist without detection. This situation clearly reflected the limitations of personal data management systems in that era, where lack of interconnection between agencies allowed an individual to exist legally, even when their history could not be fully reconstructed. For Jacob, this meant that the new identity was not only socially accepted but also administratively maintained, despite having no ability to self-prove continuity or origin. The mismatched records did not lead to systemic re-questioning, as there were no criteria or mechanisms to compare them with a missing person record stored elsewhere. Within the framework of this section, Jacob's existence was reflected through data rather than emotion, through administrative gaps rather than personal memories, showing how an individual could slip through various layers of control without leaving strong enough signs to be identified. By the end of this period, Jacob existed in the system as a valid but untraceable individual, with educational, medical, and residential records sufficient for current life operations, but completely lacking the foundational data needed to determine true origin, creating an administrative entity complete in form but hollow in history. From the gaps and mismatches in personal records, a new form of awareness gradually formed in Jacob, not erupting into crisis or clear questions, but existing as a smoldering feeling of difference that he could not name. This awareness did not arise from a specific event, but accumulated through many small experiences, as Jacob gradually realized that the way he existed in the family and society did not fully align with the familiar stories others told about their childhood and origins. He began to recognize that he lacked the foundational memories that others took for granted, that his own childhood stories were often short, generic, and lacking depth, while those around him could easily recount specific details from a very young age. This difference was initially explained by Jacob as a personal trait, a memory deficiency, or a different way of growing up. But over time, as it repeated enough in various social situations, the sense of abnormality became sharper. Alongside this, small contradictions in the information provided by the foster family gradually emerged, not as obvious lies, but as inconsistent details between stories told at different times. Changes in explanations about the past, silences when Jacob asked about a specific period, or evasive answers when mentioning the early years created a feeling that something was not being fully disclosed. These contradictions were not large enough to be seen as evidence of intentional concealment, but they were sufficient to undermine the certainty Jacob once had about his life story. From the discrepancy between personal awareness and family information, questions about origin began to form cautiously, not as doubts needing immediate answers, but as unclear matters out of reach. Jacob did not have a specific moment of awakening, but went through a long process in which the question "where do I come from?" appeared, and then was pushed back, because there was no context or strong enough motivation to pursue it fully. The absence of an independent verification channel further reinforced this suspended state, as Jacob had no tools or reliable sources to compare what he heard with objective reality. Administrative records provided no answers. The foster family offered no clear information, and the surrounding society had no mechanisms to support tracing personal origins, especially in an era where data access was limited and fragmented. In that context, doubt did not develop into action, but existed as a background layer of awareness, influencing how Jacob viewed himself and relationships with others. He began to feel he stood apart from common narratives, not fully belonging to familiar family or community patterns, but also lacking enough evidence to define how he was different. The prolongation of this doubtful state created a quiet instability, where Jacob both accepted the reality he lived in and held within himself an unanswered question, and that parallelism made the doubt more persistent than intense. Each time he encountered a small contradiction in information or a gap in memory, the doubt was reinforced a bit more, but never enough to cross the threshold requiring direct confrontation. The lack of verification channels meant every thought effort looped back to the starting point, as any assumption could neither be confirmed nor refuted, making pursuit of the origin question tiring and unmotivated. In the social environment of the time, where questioning personal origins was not common or encouraged, Jacob received no signals that his doubt was valid or needed resolution. Instead, he learned to live with the ambiguity, seeing it as an inseparable part of himself, and continued functioning within the current identity framework. Doubt persisted over the years, not manifesting as conflict or action, but gradually shaping how Jacob built his personal identity, as he became more cautious in sharing about the past, and reserved in forming deep connections with others. This state did not disrupt daily life, but it created a unique cognitive foundation, where Jacob always felt part of his story lay beyond understanding, a part he could neither reach nor ignore. Within the framework of this section, doubt existed as a prolonged internal process, not leading to specific action, not changing the current identity, but quietly accumulating and shaping self-perception. By the end of this period, Jacob was no closer to answers about his origin, but also no longer fully believed in the story he was living, creating a suspended state between acceptance and skepticism, where the question of origin still existed as a silent background, awaiting different conditions, at a different time, to potentially be brought to light. From a state of smoldering doubt that had formed but never transformed into concrete action, Jacob entered adulthood with a stable legal identity fully recognized by society, sufficient to allow him to function completely within civil, economic, and family structures without encountering any significant barriers. The name Jacob had used since childhood continued to be consistently maintained across all official documents, from employment records, residency registrations, administrative obligations, to other civil transactions, creating a continuous chain of data from the moment the new identity was established. This chain of data, though lacking a foundation from the infancy period, was still sufficient to meet the system's requirements, as authorities were only concerned with current validity rather than demanding full traceability of personal history. In that environment, Jacob built his career in a practical and cautious manner, choosing jobs that offered stability over risk, where his identity was defined by professional role, responsibilities, and performance, rather than by personal backstory or origin. Work became an important pillar that helped Jacob position himself in adult society, providing a sense of control and value while overshadowing unresolved questions about the past. Alongside his career, Jacob built his own family, entering long-term committed relationships based on the present and future, where the legal identity he carried was accepted as a given. Forming a family placed Jacob in the roles of husband, father, or emotional pillar, forcing him to prioritize stability, responsibility, and consistency in behavior, thereby further pushing personal doubts about origins away from the center of attention. In family life, Jacob did not lack connection or obligations, but there remained an unnamed silence where his past had few details to share, and his personal story was recounted in a simplified way, avoiding areas of ambiguity that he himself could not explain. Personal doubts about origins thus did not disappear but existed as a silent underlying layer of awareness, not causing overt crisis, but never resolved. Jacob was aware that something in his life story was incomplete, that his early years were not anchored by memories or documents like those of others, but he also understood that pursuing those questions would require major disruption to the carefully built life. No systematic search for origins was undertaken, not because Jacob had completely abandoned the desire to understand himself, but because there was no clear starting point to turn doubt into action. Administrative records provided no specific clues, the foster family offered no consistent information, and the surrounding society had no mechanisms to support tracing personal origins, causing any intent to investigate to circle back to the starting point without progress. Instead, Jacob chose to continue living within the framework of his current identity, viewing it as the only reliable foundation to maintain stability for himself and those dependent on him. Jacob's adult life was thus marked by familiar milestones such as career advancement, family responsibilities, and social obligations, while the inner story of origins and identity remained in an incomplete state. Throughout that period, the case of the disappearance of Jacob Jones under the old name remained dormant in the cold case system, existing as an entity completely separate from Jacob's current personal life. These two realities existed in parallel without intersecting. One was the life of an adult with a legal identity and clear responsibilities, the other a unsolved missing child file, stored and waiting in silence. No event in Jacob's adult life was strong enough to break that parallelism, as there were no signs, memories, or information directly linking him to the night. This separation created a prolonged paradox, where the same person existed in two different timelines without awareness of the other's existence. Within the scope of this section, Jacob's adult life is described as a process of continuation rather than confrontation, where he chose to build the present based on what was available rather than delving into the voids of the past. By the end of this phase, Jacob had shaped himself into a stable adult with clear work, family, and social roles, while questions about origins remained unanswered, and the case bearing the name Jacob Jones stayed dormant in cold case status, continuing to exist outside his awareness, awaiting an external factor beyond his personal life that could alter that parallel relationship. While Jacob's adult life continued to operate stably without any signs that the past was about to return, in a completely different branch of the justice system, structural changes began to occur in how unsolved cases were viewed and handled. Under increasing pressure from the backlog of files spanning decades, coupled with the gradual development of modern investigative methods, authorities proceeded to establish or restructure units dedicated to cold cases, with the goal not of rapid response to new incidents, but of revisiting old cases that had been set aside due to lack of tools or resources. This restructuring led to a shift in investigative mindset, where long-dormant cases were no longer seen as exhausted but as files with potential if approached differently. In that context, child disappearances from decades past became a prioritized group for review, as they were both highly serious and had potential for resolution through advances in forensic science and data management. The review process did not start by immediately selecting a specific case, but by developing criteria to identify which files had the greatest potential for effective reopening, including the completeness of archive data, the existence of surviving witnesses, and the applicability of new investigative tools previously unavailable. These criteria served as an initial filter, narrowing hundreds of cases down to a smaller group for deeper consideration. In applying those criteria, the file on Jacob Jones's disappearance gradually returned to the review list, not due to new information emerging, but because the nature of the case fit the conditions the cold case unit was seeking. Jacob Jones was a child who disappeared in an urban setting, The file had aged enough for initial emotional and pressure factors to subside, yet original data still existed that could be re-examined with fresh eyes. Inclusion on the priority list did not mean immediate reopening, but marked a perceptual shift, where the file was no longer considered closed in terms of possibility, but became an object for re-evaluation in a modern context. Initiating the review of old files was more technical than direct investigation, focusing on collecting, organizing, and reassessing all documents stored from the initial investigation phase. Reports, statements, notes, and records were retrieved from archives, not to immediately seek overlooked clues but to understand how the prior investigation operated, what assumptions guided decisions, and what data may have been undervalued given the era's limitation. This process proceeded slowly and systematically, as the goal was not quick action, but building a solid foundation of understanding before considering any new steps. The review also included assessing the quality and integrity of archived data, identifying gaps due to lost documents, recording errors, or technical limitations, and noting them as factors for future decisions. Throughout this phase, the Jacob Jones case remained in limbo, not yet officially reopened but no longer forgotten in storage, reflecting the spirit of a system preparing to revisit old questions with new tools. For the cold case unit, returning this file to the list was not a promise of results, but an acknowledgement that limitations once causing deadlock may no longer apply in the current context. Within this section, the decision to reopen formed as a gradual process, starting with organizational structural changes, followed by systematic review, and culminating in identifying Jacob Jones as a case meeting conditions for reconsideration. By the end of this phase, the case had left absolute dormancy, entering a transitional zone where past and present began to have potential contact, though no active investigative actions were yet deployed, and everything remained at the preparation stage for a reopening possibility that the system was only beginning to accept. After the Jacob Jones file was returned to the cold case unit's priority list, the next step in the investigative process was determined to be the application of modern scientific tools that did not exist at the time of the original incident, with DNA and genetic genealogy becoming the primary focus to overcome limitations of paperwork and human testimony. The initial step was collecting indirect DNA samples, a complex task requiring absolute caution in both legal and technical aspects, as Jacob had been missing for decades, with no direct biological samples preserved from childhood. Investigators had to identify surviving individuals with direct blood relations to Jacob, typically close relatives, and persuade them to legally provide biological samples while ensuring collection, storage, and transport complied fully with strict oversight protocols to avoid legal disputes or technical errors. In this process, investigators and DNA experts coordinated closely to identify viable DNA sources, assess relevance, and select samples most likely to provide leads. Each sample underwent technical analysis in the lab, including preparation, sequencing, and quality checks, to ensure accurate and reliable data. Additionally, information on age, family relationships, and residency history was integrated with DNA data to support matching, creating a temporary database to track potential connections and record verification steps. Once indirect DNA samples were sequenced, they were subjected to genetic genealogy analysis, a method combining genetic data with pedigree research to identify blood relations without relying on paperwork or administrative records. This analysis required building extended family trees based on shared DNA segments among individuals in databases, thereby inferring close or distant relatives to the victim. Building family trees required not only DNA data, but also family record research, cross-referencing demographic information, and multiple verifications for accuracy. In Jacob's case, this method was particularly important as it allowed bypassing barriers of altered identity and decades-long administrative gaps, approaching the victim from a purely biological perspective where prior administrative data and witness memories were no longer valuable or were limited. The entire genealogy analysis was conducted with tight interdisciplinary coordination involving geneticists, genealogy specialists, and investigators, each handling specific tasks to maintain accuracy and transparency of results while noting potential connections for subsequent investigative steps. As DNA data was sequenced, it was matched against millions of records in forensic and other legal databases to identify potential biological relationships. This matching did not seek perfect matches, but scanned for shared DNA segments sufficient to suggest close or distant kinship, thereby narrowing the scope and creating viable investigative paths. During matching, a partial match emerged, indicating clear biological linkage between the indirect sample and an individual or group in the database, though not providing specific identity, yet sufficient to prove the biological tracing path was feasible and valuable. The partial match was not just a potential sign, but shifted the entire investigative approach from reliance on paperwork, testimony, and behavioral hypotheses to building paths on firmer biological ground. Results were rigorously verified to rule out coincidence or technical error. With DNA segments analyzed multiple times, cross-referenced with other samples, and evaluated under the highest scientific standards for reliability. The emergence of the partial match created new momentum in the investigation, breaking the long silence of the cold case file and providing a specific, feasible direction to proceed. This direction relied not on temporary clues, but on stable biological data, less affected by time or human subjectivity. To maximize the partial match's value, investigators implemented follow-up steps, including identifying potential blood relations, screening identity information, gathering supporting data from legal sources, and carefully documenting analyses to avoid overinterpretation or premature conclusion. Alongside data processing, the partial match also changed resource allocation in the investigative team. More personnel and time were redirected to focus on suggested biological relationships, while behavioral hypotheses or fragmented administrative leads were temporarily deprioritized. This created a new investigative model where scientific data guided all decisions, from identifying subjects to approach to sequencing next steps. Each step was detailed, from DNA collection, sequencing, genealogy analysis, to system matching, maintaining a full verification chain and ensuring results could be presented transparently legally, if needed. Throughout this process, the partial match was not a final conclusion but a guiding hypothesis, opening possibilities to connect Jacob's present and past. It proved biological data could break decades-old barriers, allowing identification of unrecognized relationships and guiding the investigation towards serious file reopening. From here, the cold case team no longer operated in indefinite waiting, but had a powerful scientific tool as pivot, enabling subsequent steps based on evidence rather than assumption, marking the first time since Jacob's disappearance that investigators had a practical guide to trace the victim's true identity, though the final identity remained undetermined and conclusions still out of reach at this point. The partial match was not just a scientific signal but reshaped the team's thinking, causing new data to be evaluated first through biological linkage, thereby guiding further checks, subject selection, and resource allocation on DNA basis, creating an unprecedented investigative model. This process lasted weeks, requiring careful documentation, multiple cross-data verifications, match probability assessments, and filtering unrelated relationships, ensuring results were considered in probabilistic scientific and genealogical context, while protecting legal integrity and transparency. By the end of this phase, a new investigative direction had formed, sufficient to open more direct tracing steps, while creating a solid scientific foundation unprecedented in prior efforts. The partial match proved that applying DNA and genealogy was not merely supplementary but capable of transforming the entire investigative structure, moving the Jacob Jones file from cold case waiting to a specific, feasible path, guided by scientific data, marking a critical turning point in the case resolution process. A critical step aimed at transitioning from scientific clues to hypotheses that could guide subsequent investigative steps, while still remaining at the analytical level without any direct contact with individuals. The focus of this phase was analyzing the family tree constructed from the DNA data, where each family branch was examined based on the degree of genetic match, blood relationships, and the living history of each individual. The investigators worked closely with genealogy experts to form relationship diagrams, noting detailed connections, while also evaluating factors such as geographic location, age, timing, and related administrative data to identify branches that could have direct or indirect links to Jacob Jones. Analyzing the family tree was not just about assessing biological relationships, but also about checking the feasibility of each branch in connecting to the victim based on the time of disappearance, the ages of the individuals, and the geographic conditions at that time. Branches that did not meet these criteria were eliminated, helping to narrow down the number of individuals under consideration and focus resources on viable directions. This elimination process was conducted systematically, with each individual or family group evaluated to determine whether they could be the direct or indirect biological source of Jacob, based on objective factors such as age, place of residence, and potential contact with Jacob at the time of the disappearance. Incompatible branches were removed from focus, reducing the number of individuals requiring in-depth analysis and creating a short list of potential subjects. In parallel with the elimination, the investigation team cross-checked the ages and timelines of the remaining individuals to ensure that any candidate aligned with the time frame of Jacob's disappearance, thereby excluding those who could not biologically be the victim. This cross-checking relied not only on DNA data but also on historical information, residency records, movement details, and surviving administrative files, to ensure feasibility and minimize errors in identity narrowing. Upon completion of this process, the list of individuals was significantly reduced, from hundreds or dozens of branches in the family tree to a limited number sufficient for further in-depth analysis, but without proceeding to direct contact. The investigation team created a table ranking each individual by priority level, based on biological probability, temporal and geographic fit, and potential to provide information in subsequent investigative steps. Each remaining individual was noted in detail regarding blood relationships, age differences, residence at the time of Jacob's disappearance, and all related administrative data. This not only helped organize subsequent analysis steps, but also created a detailed database that could be verified and accessed in the future, ensuring the scientific rigor and transparency of the entire process. Throughout the narrowing phase, family branches were carefully evaluated to identify focal points where the likelihood of Jacob was highest, based on biological data and supporting factors. These branches were determined by combining DNA matches, fetal timelines, and geographic indicators. The investigation team emphasized these focal points to prepare for the next step, where additional analyses could be deployed to further narrow the list. The steps in the narrowing process were documented in detail, including eliminated branches, reasons for exclusion, and the scientific basis for decisions, ensuring that all results could be verified later. This helped maintain the objectivity and scientific integrity of the process, avoiding decisions based on intuition or external pressure. At the same time, the investigation team used the family tree to visualize the entire network of potential biological relationships related to Jacob, identifying branches likely to contain the true identity and pinpointing key areas for deeper analysis. The identification of priority subjects was not based on intuition, but on DNA evidence, timeline cross-checking, geography, and biological feasibility, ensuring that the list was realistic and viable for subsequent steps. Throughout this process, all analyses were conducted within legal and scientific frameworks, with no direct contact with listed individuals, to preserve objectivity and avoid legal risk. All data was carefully recorded and stored, from initial analyses, match verifications, to branch classifications and subject lists. The identity narrowing also helped the investigation team clearly identify key relationships in the family tree, enabling scientific planning for subsequent steps. Prioritized branches, marked focal points, and potential individuals were tracked as independent analysis units, ensuring that later tracing would be systematic and minimize the risk of overlooking critical information. Within this section, the focus was on analysis and preparation, without delving into tracing or contacting individuals, ensuring the objectivity and scientific nature of the process. By the end of this phase, the investigation team had a limited list of identified family branches and key individuals based on scientific evidence and genealogical data, laying the foundation for transitioning to subsequent steps to verify Jacob's true identity while maintaining safety and information control until contact steps were authorized. As soon as the list of key individuals was formed from DNA data and genealogical analysis, the cold case unit began implementing the process of reopening the Jacob Jones file, a complex and meticulous step aimed at connecting modern data with the original 1960 records, while identifying old systemic errors or omissions that could affect determining the victim's true identity. The work started with a detailed comparison of each item in the original file, including witness statements, investigator notes, area diagrams, personnel information, recorded timelines, and administrative data, such as medical records, school file or temporary documents related to Jacob, with data collected through modern technology, from DNA analysis and genealogy to updated population and legal record. This comparison was conducted systematically, with each item evaluated individually and cross-referenced with modern data to detect anomalies, errors, gaps or inconsistencies previously identified, while re-recording all valid information that could support tracing the identity. Old systemic errors were discovered in various forms, from misrecorded timelines, locations, witness names, to administrative data gaps regarding biological documents and medical records. There were even overlapping entries not clearly categorized, making it difficult to connect data to Jacob's actual identity when first examined from a modern scientific perspective. These findings not only confirmed that the initial file had many limitations due to 1960-era technology and investigative methods, but also reinforced the hypothesis that Jacob's identity had been altered or stolen administratively, creating a legal and biological gap in which his life under the new identity existed. Identifying these errors also helped the investigation team recognize data branches needing cross-verification, where conflicting or inconsistent data could eliminate confusion in subsequent analysis. Once data branches were confirmed and old errors identified, the investigation team could strengthen the hypothesis that Jacob was still alive, with DNA data and genealogical analysis providing the basis to identify directly suspected individuals related to his true identity. Despite previous inaccessibility due to administrative limitations and information shortages, identifying these suspected individuals relied on multiple factors: blood relationships, geographic location, age, mobility potential, and historical connections recorded in the old file, combined with modern genealogical system data to exclude unsuitable individuals and prioritize those with the highest likelihood. This was a meticulous process requiring investigators to not only analyze data carefully, but also compile detailed profiles for each individual, recording all elimination steps, prioritization reasons, and scientific basis for every decision. In parallel with identifying suspected individuals, the investigation team began preparing subsequent verification steps, including planning approaches, preparing legal procedures for direct DNA collection, anticipating interactions with families and related individuals, and implementing measures to ensure privacy and safety for all parties involved. This was a detailed and extremely important preparation phase, as any oversight could affect the legality of collected DNA samples and reduce the reliability of future investigative results. Throughout the file reopening process, the investigation team maintained careful recording and storage of all decisions, comparison data, branch classification results, and subject lists. This served not only scientific and legal purposes, but also created a transparent foundation so that any subsequent steps could proceed without repeating the entire process, while ensuring decisions could be proven and reviewed if necessary. Reopening the file also involved cross-referencing modern data with old administrative records and investigative notes, helping the team identify areas of lingering data deficiencies, unverified family branches, and feasible relationships possibly overlooked in prior investigation. Each comparison, evaluation, and confirmation step was performed carefully to ensure all directions were based on scientific and verified data, minimizing risks of being led by assumptions or unverified information. The partial DNA match, when integrated with the family tree, allowed the investigation team to discover potential biological connections, identify branches likely to contain Jacob's true identity. These branches were analyzed in detail, eliminating unsuitable ones based on disappearance timing, age, and residence location, thereby shortening the list of suspected individuals, focusing resources, and preparing for subsequent scientific approaches. The file reopening process was not just data comparison, but a combination of scientific analysis, genealogy, administrative history, and investigative expertise, forming a comprehensive picture strong enough to establish scientifically based direction. Although Jacob's final identity remained undetermined, all steps were conducted within strict legal frameworks, with interagency coordination among DNA experts, genealogy specialists, and investigators, ensuring accuracy, transparency, and verifiability of data. In this phase, the investigation team clearly recognized that combining modern data with old records not only helped identify Jacob's potential identity, but also exposed limitations of the initial investigation, from recording errors and data conflicts to information gaps that era's technology could not fill. These identifications allowed reinforcing the hypothesis that Jacob's identity had been changed, and he was still alive, creating the basis for continuing direct scientification steps. The result of the file reopening phase was creating a solid analytical foundation. Old errors identified, unsuitable branches eliminated, suspected individuals determined and prioritized, and investigative directions, based on DNA and genealogy, clearly formed, ready for real-world approaches in subsequent case sections. By the end of this phase, the Jacob Jones file had entered a thoroughly prepared state for verification implementation, marking the first time since his disappearance that the investigation had a scientific picture and complete data to proceed to the next step. Although the specific identity remained undetermined and final conclusion still out of reach. As soon as the list of suspected individuals was narrowed from DNA analysis and family tree results, the investigation team entered the direct verification phase, a crucial step to confirm Jacob Jones's true identity. This process began with tightly planning approaches to each individual, ensuring legal privacy and safety factors. Investigators coordinated with law enforcement agencies and consulting experts to contact suspected individuals, clearly presenting the investigation's purpose, their rights and obligations, and persuading them to cooperate in providing direct DNA samples. This preparation required thorough coordination among departments, from investigators to forensic experts and legal specialists, to ensure every step complied with regulations, while maintaining transparency and future probability. Upon successful contact, the team conducted administrative verification, examining all related records of the suspected individual, from identification documents, residency records, educational and medical files, to other civil documents. The goal of verification was to cross-reference current information with historical data, check continuity, confirm legal identity, and provide a comprehensive picture before proceeding to direct DNA collection. Throughout this phase, steps were performed to legal standards, with detailed recording of each cross-referenced item, noting any differences or anomalies as basis for subsequent analyses. Next was the direct DNA collection step, where biological samples were taken from the suspected individual using standard procedures, including oral swab collection, processing, and storage under strictly controlled conditions, to ensure integrity. These samples were then sequenced and compared biologically with previously collected indirect DNA and genealogical data. The biological matching process was the key step, involving evaluation of genetic overlap, kinship probability, and other scientific parameters to ensure absolute accuracy. Each sample was analyzed multiple times, cross-referenced with prior data, feasibility checked for every result, and all steps meticulously recorded to ensure transparency and legal traceability. During analysis, results showed the suspected individual biologically matched the indirect DNA sample and genealogical data. Sufficient to confirm this was Jacob Jones, the victim missing. This identity confirmation relied not on a single factor, but on the synthesis of all scientific evidence, administrative data, and legal checks, ensuring maximum reliability and acceptability within the legal system. This confirmation held significant meaning, not only legally but also opened possibilities for transitioning to family reunification. While preparing for investigations related to the disappearance context, surrounding relationships, and re-examining old hypotheses, every step in the verification process was fully recorded and stored, from approach planning, administrative verification, direct DNA collection, to biological analysis results, ensuring the entire process could be presented transparently and re-verified if needed. Identity confirmation also marked a turning point in the decades-long investigation, when the long-forgotten cold case file was directly connected to reality, transforming from paper data into a living person. The investigation team, after confirming the identity, continued preparing logistics for contacting the biological family, planning reunification, and verifying blood relationship information, all based on certified scientific data and legal results. Throughout the process, the investigation team maintained objectivity, not relying on personal opinions or unverified information, ensuring every step had scientific and legal basis, while protecting Jacob's rights in privacy. Identity confirmation not only concluded the scientific investigation phase, but also laid the groundwork for transitioning to restoring family connections, preparing psychologically and legally for reunification, and handling issues related to administrative records, legal documents, and societal recognition of identity. By the end of this phase, Jacob Jones's identity had been accurately verified, all scientific data and administrative records fully cross-referenced, and the investigation team was ready to proceed to subsequent steps, ensuring that family reconnection and related legal issues would be conducted on a solid scientific and legal foundation. This process marked the most important success in efforts to resolve the case after 45 years, when Jacob's disappearance was no longer an unanswered question, but clearly established based on verified scientific, legal, and historical evidence. Immediately after Jacob Jones's identity was confirmed through DNA results and genealogical analysis, the investigation team shifted its focus to restoring family relationships, the first step in the reunification process after 45 long years of disappearance. First, all blood relationships were officially verified through additional DNA cross-matching and comparison with records of surviving family members, ensuring that every related individual was accurately identified before any contact was made. This verification of blood ties carried not only legal significance, but also emotional value, laying the foundation for reconnecting with biological family and preparing a safe, transparent environment for the meeting. Next, the investigation team proceeded to contact the surviving members of Jacob's family, including parents, siblings, and close extended relatives, informing them of his current status, providing details about his newly verified identity, and preparing them psychologically for the reunion. This contact process was handled carefully and step by step, ensuring that all parties fully understood Jacob's rights, privacy, and autonomy, while minimizing potential negative reactions after decades of separation. Calls, letters, emails, or other forms of contact were meticulously planned, prioritized based on closeness of relationship and Jacob's readiness to receive the information, ensuring every step was tightly controlled and free from unnecessary pressure. Once the preparatory steps were complete, the in-person meeting between Jacob and his family members was organized in a safe, private, and controlled environment, ensuring that all interactions proceeded smoothly and respectfully for everyone involved. This was the first time Jacob had seen his family in over 4 decades, and the meeting was not just a personal reunion but also a milestone marking the end of years of search. In that moment, every family member, now elderly and having endured many life events, recognized Jacob's real existence, and long-suppressed emotions from anxiety and confusion to unconfirmed hope were partially released through the direct encounter and confirmation of blood ties. This meeting not only closed the search phase but also opened a new one, where Jacob began reintegrating with his family and restoring relationships interrupted decades earlier. The investigation team continued to assist by transferring information, providing documents related to Jacob's past and identity, helping family members understand the current situation, and facilitating the rebuilding of bonds. Every step was carefully managed to allow Jacob to gradually become familiar, converse, and build a sense of security, while maintaining his autonomy in all decisions regarding family and social interaction. During the reunification process, discussions about the past were carefully moderated, providing enough information for the family to understand while avoiding overwhelming Jacob with memories he could not yet confront in a short. Records documenting the entire process, from initial contact, reactions of all parties, details of the in-person meeting, to emotional responses and support methods, were carefully archived to ensure transparency and future verifiability. The reunification process also formally closed the official search phase. Jacob was no longer a cold case file, but but a fully confirmed, living individual recognized within his family. This was the outcome of years of scientific investigation, genealogical analysis, DNA verification, and record review, from initial small clues to the application of modern scientific tools. Emotions and relationships disrupted for decades began to be rebuilt as Jacob and his family learned to reconnect while establishing new bonds based on present reality. In this section, the reunification is presented as the direct consequence of the entire investigative process, no longer exploratory or searching, but a human connection between people, past and present. It also serves as an important transition to subsequent issues where psychological, legal and social aspects are prepared for Jacob's reintegration with his family and building a new life after years of interruption and adaptation to his true identity. By the end of this phase, the reunification was complete with confirmed blood relationships, Jacob reuniting with family members after decades apart, and the entire search phase from his disappearance to identity verification and formal family approach officially closed. All prior investigative efforts were proven effective through this outcome, while opening the next step, addressing legal, emotional, and social consequences, ensuring Jacob and his family could reintegrate into current reality and creating conditions to continue resolving issues related to the perpetrator and remaining mysteries in subsequent sections. Immediately after Jacob Jones was reunited with his family and his biological identity confirmed through DNA verification and genealogy steps, the post-reunification phase began, focusing on stabilizing legal identity, psychological support, long-term adaptation, and managing social impacts while preparing for real life after decades of separation. The first task was adjusting legal identity, officially linking the identity Jacob had used for decades to his original records, thereby legalizing all documents from birth certificate, passport and ID, to medical, educational and other administrative records. This process was carried out in close coordination with legal authorities, record specialists, and legal counsel to ensure all data was consistent, accurately reflected his true identity, protected his legal rights, and avoided future risks or disputes. In parallel with legal identity adjustment, Jacob was provided access to psychological support services to help him adapt to profound life changes. After decades living under a different identity and separated from his biological family, reintegration became complex and stressful as he faced fragmented memories, childhood losses, long-term confusion and doubt, and a mix of familiarity and strangeness with his current family. Psychologists specializing in recovery after disappearances accompanied Jacob, offering individual and group therapy to help him confront, process and release suppressed emotions, learn to build healthy relationships with parents, siblings and other relatives. At the same time, experts guided Jacob in recognizing, analyzing and managing complex emotions, from joy and surprise to confusion and skepticism, helping him gradually rebuild mental stability and a sense of security in the new environment. Additionally, media impact became a key factor needing control during the post-reunification phase. Local and national media showed strong interest in the case from Jacob's disappearance 45 years earlier to the reunification, creating a wave of public attention. The investigation team and family had to carefully manage public information, selecting what could be shared, release formats, timing and narrative style to protect privacy, avoid public pressure, and ensure the story was conveyed accurately and respectfully toward those involved. Media involvement offered opportunities for community support, but also challenges in maintaining privacy and psychological stability for Jacob, especially as he began adapting back to family and society. Jacob's long-term adaptation process involved many aspects: social integration, building and maintaining family relationships, managing personal emotions, adapting to work, education and current social interactions, while adjusting habits, responses and behaviors from the old identity that had persisted for years. This process did not happen quickly. Jacob needed time to rediscover himself, establish new family relationships, and reshape his personal identity in the current context. This adaptation required patience, ongoing support from family, psychologists, and social resources, as well as Jacob learning to balance a fragmented past, interrupted childhood memories, and a present with new responsibilities, obligations and family ties. The social consequences of the reunification and identity confirmation profoundly affected Jacob, his family, and the surrounding community. The family recognized Jacob's real presence, influencing how they organized daily activities, roles, social relationships, and routines to accommodate him. This change extended beyond the family to the community, as those who had participated in the search or followed the case became aware of Jacob's actual existence, shaping societal reception and response to a story spanning over 4 decades. Throughout the post-reunification phase, Jacob and his family learned to re-establish relationships, adjust emotions, handle psychological and social reactions, and maintain long-term stability. Each step was carefully planned and monitored, from managing media information, psychological support, and legal document adjustments, to rebuilding family bonds, ensuring Jacob could fully integrate and achieve stability in legal, emotional, and social terms. In this section, the post-reunification phase is described as a stabilization process, where Jacob and his family learned to live together after decades apart, manage media impacts, maintain legal identity, build long-term adaptation strategies, and lay the foundation for enduring life. By the end of this phase, Jacob had reached stability in legal, psychological, and social aspects, marking the conclusion of post-reunification and paving the way for subsequent steps, addressing remaining issues and long-term adaptation to current life. Immediately after Jacob Jones's identity was confirmed and he reunited with his family, the investigation team shifted focus to re-examining old hypotheses about the perpetrator potentially responsible for the abduction, while assessing potential suspects that had not been fully pursued in the past or lacked direct connecting evidence. The review began with analyzing all archived data from the 1980 case file, including witness statements, investigator notes, scene reports, lists of individuals connected to the area, and details about people present around the time Jacob disappeared. The team carefully examined each detail, placing it in the current context with new data from DNA and genealogy analysis to assess feasibility and relevance of each hypothesis. Each hypothesis was systematically analyzed based on criteria: temporal reasonableness, capability to commit the act, connection to the victim, and compatibility with modern scientific data. Hypotheses previously dismissed due to technical limitations or missing data were re-evaluated, with new genealogy and DNA information providing grounds for investigators to screen, eliminate less viable leads, and focus on those supported by evidence. This process required close coordination among investigators, forensic experts, and data analysts to ensure all conclusions were based on objective data, not personal opinions or subjective assumptions. In parallel with hypothesis review, the team compiled a list of potential suspects based on family connections, geographic location, recorded unusual past behaviors, and historical residency data. The list was prioritized by access potential, temporal and geographic fit, and likelihood of related evidence for verification. Individuals already cleared or no longer relevant were retained in subsidiary files for reference, ensuring no important information was overlooked if new data emerged or evidence was clarified from other sources. The status of physical evidence was thoroughly reviewed in the current context, recognizing that most original items, traces, and records had faded, deteriorated, or been lost over time. The team assessed the feasibility of using old evidence, identified recoverable items, and combined them with DNA and genealogy data to strengthen hypotheses. This required detailed classification of each piece of evidence, noting origin, preservation status, and compatibility with modern data, ensuring all information used in suspect evaluation was reliable. Legal barriers were also a significant factor limiting prosecution potential, as some suspects were deceased, had moved outside prosecutable jurisdiction, or the elapsed time made direct evidence collection difficult. Gaps in old records, administrative errors, and evidence degradation further restricted closing the case through traditional criminal procedure. The team noted these limitations, categorized legal issues, and identified feasible steps within current legal frameworks, while preparing contingencies if new information appeared or advanced analytical technology could clarify old data. Due to these physical and legal factors, the case could not be fully closed, even though Jacob's identity was confirmed and the family reunited. The team maintained detailed records of suspects, unproven hypotheses, and existing evidence, but the goal in this phase was not immediate prosecution, but keeping the case in a controlled open status. Every evaluation step was fully documented, from reasons for excluding suspects, evidence reliability assessments, to feasibility of access and future hypothesis development. Analyses also included re-evaluating the original investigation process, identifying points where errors or old system limitations affected suspect identification, thereby planning optimizations for subsequent steps. The team noted factors like delays in data recording, overlooked witness statements, and 1980-era investigative scope limitations, ensuring current decisions relied on scientific data and methods to minimize error. In this section, the focus is on reviewing, evaluating, and documenting hypotheses, suspects, and evidence, maintaining comprehensive scientific and legal records without direct pursuit steps, keeping the case controlled and ready for activation upon new information. Steps include classifying and re-evaluating all remaining physical evidence, reviewing old witness statements, assessing legal status of each potential suspect, and contingency planning for new supporting data or technology. By the end of this phase, the team had completed identifying viable suspect branches, evaluating prosecution potential, documenting physical and legal limitations, and preparing a comprehensive database ready for any future approaches. Some questions remained unanswered, but all decisions were carefully recorded and controlled, creating a controlled open status, keeping the file active without neglect, while ensuring action capability when conditions allow, protecting Jacobs and related parties' rights and maintaining scientific and legal integrity throughout. After more than 4 decades since Jacob Jones disappeared, the case was finally resolved at the identity level, with him confirmed as a survivor and reunited with his biological family. Verifying Jacob's identity not only ended decades of search deadlock, but also closed a long chapter in cold case history, providing legal and emotional certainty for the victim's family. Although identity was confirmed, questions about the direct perpetrator of the abduction remained unresolved. Legal barriers, loss of physical evidence, and the long time gap made pursuing the perpetrator difficult, and currently, identifying the offender remains an unfinished challenge. This places the case in a controlled open status, where the victim's identity is confirmed, but criminal accountability for the perpetrator cannot yet be enforced. The role of technology in breaking the case's deadlock is a standout and unprecedented factor in prior investigative history. Applying DNA and genealogical analysis allowed the team to overcome limitations of paper records and witness statements, creating a scientific method to verify Jacob's identity and opening new approaches unattainable by traditional investigation. This technology completely changed the view of cold cases, showing that seemingly hopeless files could still be resolved with modern tools. DNA verification results not only confirmed Jacob was alive, but also strengthened hypotheses about altered identity, provided grounds for family relationship restoration, and set an important precedent for handling similar cases. The impact of resolving the Jacob Jones case spread widely. It serves as clear evidence of the effectiveness of reopening cold cases with modern technology support. Many other long-term child disappearance cases in the system began to be reviewed, with hope that similar methods could provide new clues and viable direction. The success of Jacob Jones's case reinforced confidence among investigative agencies, victim support organizations, and families that scientific data, genealogical analysis, and DNA could clarify cases thought unsolvable. It also drove improvements in record storage procedures, interagency coordination, and modern technology application in managing unresolved cases, creating new standards for cold case activity. Although Jacob's identity was confirmed, the direct abduction perpetrator has not been held accountable, leaving some legal and criminal questions unanswered. The team documented legal limitations, physical evidence loss, and other barriers, while maintaining records of suspects, unproven hypotheses, and remaining evidence. This ensures that if new information or advanced analytical technology emerges, the investigation can restart without beginning from scratch, preserving continuity and future prosecution potential. This status is managed controllably, protecting Jacobs and related parties' rights, while keeping the case under legal system oversight. Closing the investigation at the identity level marks the official end of the entire process from Jacob's disappearance, while leaving room for subsequent handling of legal, emotional and social consequences. Jacob's current file is fully archived, with all scientific data and administrative records and verification steps meticulously documented, ensuring any future developments can be handled quickly and effectively. This also guarantees conclusions achieve high reliability, scientific and legal grounding, and transparency if presented to authority. In this section, the case conclusion emphasizes that resolution at the identity level does not mean closing all perpetrator-related questions, but it creates clarity and stability for the victim and family. The decisive role of modern technology is proven, breaking decades-long deadlock and providing viable paths for similar cases. The Jacob Jones case becomes a prime example of how scientific data, interagency coordination, and cold case management can deliver substantial results, while opening opportunities to apply these methods to other unresolved cases. At the end of this phase, Jacob Jones's identity has been confirmed, he has reunited with his family, and the cold case file is closed at a valid legal level, while maintaining expansion possibilities if new information arises. The entire process, from data collection, record review, DNA verification, to reunification and consequences, was conducted scientifically, legally and transparently, creating a comprehensive conclusion that remains open on perpetrator questions, ensuring the case is fully resolved at the identity level, while preserving prosecution potential when conditions permit. The story of Jacob Jones, missing for 45 years and finally identified through DNA and genealogy, offers valuable lessons for modern life in the United States today. One notable detail is how incomplete old administrative records, scattered data, and unverified family branches allowed Jacob to live outside the search system for decades, reminding us of the importance of accurate information storage and management, especially in systems involving children and vulnerable individuals. Applying modern technology like DNA and genealogy analysis shows that scientific advances can compensate for old system limitations, and in modern life, wisely utilizing technology can help detect, prevent, or resolve seemingly impossible issues. Another detail is the family reunification process, where Jacob had to adapt to his new identity, reintegrate with parents and siblings after decades apart, and overcome complex emotions like doubt, anxiety, and confusion. This highlights the value of patience, psychological support, and careful communication in restoring disrupted family relationships, a lesson applicable to any modern family facing conflict, generational gaps, or major life changes. Finally, the story shows that persistence and interagency coordination from police, scientists, and legal experts to the community are decisive in solving complex problems, reminding us in today's life that collaboration, patience, and proper tool use can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Thus, the lesson for American society today is to always pay attention to details, trust in scientific and technological progress, and value family, community, and interagency cooperation to effectively and humanely address long-term issues. Thank you for following the extraordinary story of Jacob Jones and his journey back to his family after 45 years. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other thrilling cold cases. See you in the next video.